we think of Vikings, most of us picture fearless warriors, longships cutting through the sea, and epic battles fought for glory. But behind the raids and the treasure, there's a much darker side that history often leaves in the shadows. The women taken as captives, especially the wives of enemies, faced humiliation and suffering that went far beyond what happened on the battlefield. Their stories are not about honor or glory, but about cruelty, control, and humiliation. These are accounts that reveal just how ruthless the Vikings could be when asserting dominance over their enemies. Keep watching as we uncover 10 of the most inhumane things Vikings did to their enemies' wives. Number 1. Captivity and enslavement of women. One of the most inhumane things Vikings did to their enemies' wives was to strip them of their freedom and turn them into captives, or what they called thralls. The Viking Age, which spanned roughly from the late 8th century to the early 11th century, was built in part on the system of slavery. Thralls were the lowest class in Viking society, and many of them were not born into slavery but captured during raids. Women from conquered villages, including the wives of defeated men, were among the most vulnerable to this fate. When Vikings attacked monasteries, towns, and settlements, they were not only after silver, gold, and goods. People themselves were valuable commodities. A healthy young woman could be sold in the thriving slave markets of Dublin, Hedeby, or Constantinople, sometimes fetching high prices. These women were often separated from their families, dragged onto longships, and taken hundreds of miles away to lands they had never seen before. The very act of tearing them away from their homes was an act of cruelty designed to humiliate the enemy and weaken their community. The enslavement of women also had a calculated purpose. Enemies' wives, especially if they were of noble or wealthy background, represented status and wealth. Owning or trading such captives was not only profitable, but also a way for Viking leaders to show their power. In many cases, women who were enslaved were forced to do laborious household work such as grinding grain, cooking, cleaning, and serving their masters. This reduction from the status of a respected wife to a powerless servant was a direct attack on the honor of the enemy who had lost her. Historical records from Arab travelers like Ahmad ibn Fadlan and Christian chroniclers in Europe describe the Viking slave trade as widespread and ruthless. Women were treated as movable property, no different than cattle or treasure. The lack of legal protection for thralls meant that once a woman was captured, she had no rights. This was especially cruel when one considers that many of these women had been the respected wives of warriors, landowners, or chieftains. In their homelands, they may have enjoyed security and authority within their households, only to lose everything in an instant. The trauma of enslavement went beyond physical captivity. Women were often transported to entirely different cultures where their language was not understood, cutting them off from all communication and familiarity. This sense of isolation added another layer of suffering. Many never saw their children or families again. Some were sold multiple times, moving from one master to another, each transaction erasing more of their identity and history. By targeting wives and women during raids, Vikings struck at the heart of enemy communities. Men could be killed in battle, but when women were enslaved, whole family lines were broken apart. This had long-lasting consequences because it weakened the ability of that community to recover. In this way, Viking raids were not just about immediate victory, but about leaving lasting scars on their enemies. Even though not every Viking was involved in this behaviour, and not every raid ended in the mass enslavement of women, the practice was common enough that it shaped the reputation of Vikings across Europe. In fact, the fear of being captured and enslaved was one of the reasons coastal villages lived in constant dread of Viking longships appearing on the horizon. To enemies' wives, the sound of Viking horns or the sight of their ships often meant that their lives, as they knew them, were about to end. Captivity and enslavement were, therefore, among the most inhumane acts committed by Vikings against the wives of their enemies. It stripped women of their freedom, identity, and family ties, reducing them to mere property in a world where power was measured in blood and silver. Number 2. Forced marriages and concubinage. Beyond enslavement, another inhumane practice that Vikings imposed on the wives of enemies was forced marriage or concubinage. When Vikings captured women during raids, especially those of noble or influential families, they sometimes forced them into unions with Viking men. These marriages were rarely about love or companionship. Instead, they were political tools and symbols of domination. A forced marriage was often a way to secure legitimacy over conquered lands. By marrying the wife or widow of a defeated leader, a Viking chieftain could claim authority through her lineage. This practice was not unique to Vikings, but in their case, it was part of their aggressive expansion. The woman had no choice in the matter, as refusing could mean further violence or even death. For many of these wives, their only option for survival was to submit to a new union. Concubinage, however, was far more common. High-ranking Vikings often kept concubines, women who were not their legal wives but lived with them as secondary partners. Enemies' wives who were captured in raids could be forced into this role. Unlike marriage, concubinage carried no legal rights or recognition for the woman. She was entirely at the mercy of her captor. From the Viking perspective, this served two purposes. First, it satisfied the demand for companionship and labour within their households. Second, and more cruelly, it humiliated the woman's original family and community. To see the wife of an enemy forced into a union with her captor sent a message. The Viking not only defeated the man, but also took control of his household and legacy. Some sagas and chronicles, though written later, highlight these unions. They often portray them from the male perspective, presenting women as spoils of war. But behind the warrior stories lies the silent suffering of the women. Imagine being torn away from one's husband or killed partner, only to be forced into the arms of the man who destroyed that life. It was not just physical domination, but also psychological torment, erasing the autonomy and dignity of these women. Children born from such forced unions created another layer of complication. In some cases, the offspring were recognized as legitimate heirs, especially if the woman came from a noble family. This gave the Viking father additional leverage, as he could use the child to claim land, wealth, or alliances. For the woman, however, this often meant being trapped permanently in a life she never chose, bound by the children she bore. The church and Christian chroniclers of the time condemned such practices, labelling them as sinful and barbaric. Yet, within Viking culture, forced unions were normalised to some degree, as power often dictated the rules of relationships. It illustrates a stark difference in values. What one culture viewed as an atrocity, another saw as a practical solution. For the wives of enemies, forced marriage or concubinage meant the destruction of their personal agency. They became tools for politics, symbols of conquest, and instruments of humiliation. It was a cruel reminder that in the Viking Age, the fates of women were tied closely to the power struggles of men. Number 3. Separation from families. Another deeply inhumane act committed by Vikings was the deliberate separation of wives from their families. When communities were raided, men were often killed and women and children were taken as captives. But families were rarely kept together. Instead, women were split from their children, sisters from brothers, and wives from husbands. This division was strategic. It made escape more difficult, reduced the chance of resistance, and maximised profit for the raiders. Slave markets thrived on this system. A woman might be sold in one town, her children in another, and her surviving relatives scattered across the Viking trade network. For example, Dublin became one of the largest Viking slave markets in Europe, and countless women from Britain, Ireland, and continental Europe were sold there. Traders knew that separating families increased control over captives, as despair and isolation weakened their will to resist. For wives, the pain of being separated from their children was one of the most crushing blows. In many cases, daughters were forced into servitude or concubinage, while sons were trained as slaves or soldiers for their captors. The uncertainty of never knowing what happened to their loved ones added a layer of lifelong anguish. Unlike wealth or land, family bonds could not be replaced, and the Vikings exploited this vulnerability mercilessly. Separation also served as a symbolic act of erasing an enemy's lineage. By dismantling family structures, Vikings disrupted the cultural and social fabric of the communities they attacked. Women who once had roles as mothers, wives, and caretakers suddenly found themselves stripped of identity. In Viking society, family ties were deeply important, so to rob their enemies of that same foundation was a psychological attack as much as a physical one. There are accounts from both Norse sagas and foreign chroniclers describing women being marched away in chains while their children were taken in opposite directions. Some were transported across the sea, never to return. Others ended up in lands as far as the Middle East, due to the vast Viking trade networks that stretched into Byzantium and the Islamic Caliphate. This separation of families highlights the calculated cruelty of Viking raiders. By ensuring that wives and children were scattered, they made recovery nearly impossible for those communities. It is one of the most devastating, yet often overlooked aspects of Viking warfare. While the burning of villages and the killing of warriors left visible scars, the tearing apart of families left invisible ones that lasted generations. Number 4. Ransom and exploitation. Wives of powerful or wealthy men were not always enslaved or forced into unions right away. Sometimes they were kept alive specifically for ransom. This practice may sound less brutal at first, but in reality, it was another form of exploitation that played with the lives of women for profit and power. When Vikings captured the wife of an enemy chieftain or nobleman, they understood her value extended beyond labour or companionship. She was leverage. By holding her captive, they could demand gold, silver, land, or political concessions in exchange for her release. This turned women into bargaining chips, pawns in negotiations where their lives were weighed against wealth. The ransom process was often humiliating for the women involved. They were paraded as trophies, displayed to demonstrate the captor's superiority. Sometimes negotiations dragged on for months, during which the woman remained in uncertain captivity. Even if released after ransom, the trauma of being treated as a commodity could not easily be erased. Historical records mention cases where wives of monks, nobles, or local rulers were taken specifically for this purpose. The Viking raids on Paris in the mid-9th century, for example, saw women used as leverage to extract massive payments from the Frankish rulers. In some cases, if ransom demands were not met, women were sold into slavery anyway, doubling the cruelty. For the Vikings, ransom was a lucrative strategy, but for the women, it was a dehumanizing ordeal. They were reduced to symbols of wealth and power struggles, forced to live in limbo while their families desperately tried to gather enough resources to secure their freedom. Even when successful, the ransom left communities impoverished and vulnerable to future raids, making the whole process a cycle of exploitation. Number 5. Psychological terror and symbolic violence. Finally, one of the most inhumane aspects of Viking treatment toward enemies' wives was the use of psychological terror and symbolic violence. Even when women were not immediately killed or enslaved, the fear instilled in them was itself a weapon. Viking raids were designed to terrify. The sudden arrival of longships, the burning of villages, and the brutal treatment of captives created a reputation that spread across Europe. Wives and families lived under constant anxiety, knowing that any day could bring destruction. This fear often caused communities to submit without resistance, handing over wealth or abandoning settlements rather than facing the horrors that awaited them. Symbolic acts of violence against women were also common. By targeting wives, Vikings struck at the heart of their enemy's honour. In many cultures of the time, the protection of women was tied to male pride and societal stability. To see wives taken, enslaved or humiliated was to see the total collapse of that honour. Some chronicles describe how women were paraded after capture, not just for ransom, but to send a message of dominance. This form of terror went beyond physical harm. It was psychological warfare meant to break the spirit of entire communities. Even after the raids ended, the stories of what happened lingered, spreading dread far beyond the actual battlefield. For the wives of enemies, this meant living in fear long before any raid reached them, and carrying the weight of trauma long after. In this way, psychological terror was one of the most enduring weapons Vikings used, and it magnified the suffering of women caught in their path. Number 6. Public parading and display of captured women. When Vikings took captives during raids, one common tactic to humiliate and control them was public display. After a successful raid, captives were marched through ports, market squares, or village streets where crowds could see them. This served as proof of victory, a warning to other communities, and a way to advertise the availability of slaves for sale or ransom. The parade was part spectacle, part punishment. For the women who were forced to walk under guard, the experience erased privacy and dignity. They were moved in chains or held by guards while locals looked on. Merchants and traders could examine them. Buyers could inspect potential thralls. Showing off captives in this way was intended to break spirit and discourage resistance elsewhere. In communities that watched, the image of a familiar woman in a foreign crowd was a sharp reminder of failure. If the captive was a wife of a local leader, the public display also worked as a direct attack on his reputation. In social systems where protecting one's household mattered for honour and leadership, seeing a leader's wife led away signalled that he had failed his responsibilities. That social shame could carry long after the raid, affecting alliances, marriages, and the standing of families in their region. The practice also had economic logic. Markets for slave labour existed across much of the Viking world, from the trading towns of the British Isles and Ireland to the ports of the North Sea and the Baltic, and on through routes that reached as far as Constantinople and the Islamic world. Public display allowed slaves to be matched with buyers quickly, keeping the captive economy fluid. But beyond commerce, the parade was a tool of control. It made the captive's new status visible and permanent. Even captives who later gained release or ransom would carry the memory and stigma of being not only taken, but shown. Chroniclers and travellers recorded scenes of captives being displayed, and archaeological finds support the existence of a wide slave trade network where people were moved and sold. While the sources often focus on male warriors, the records that do note women emphasise the public nature of their treatment. For women, the damage was not only material loss, but social erasure. Familiar clothing, jewellery, language, and community roles were replaced by a new condition defined by exposure and dependence on strangers. Number 7. Forced labour in public and degrading work. Enslaved women commonly ended up performing the hardest and most visible tasks under their captors. Forced labour was a daily form of humiliation because it reversed social roles. Before raids, many of these women had responsibilities that carried authority. Managing households, directing servants, or maintaining family lands. After capture, they were made to do the dirtiest chores. Grinding grain for hours, carrying water, cleaning animal stalls, scrubbing clothing, preparing food in crowded kitchens, or doing heavy field work. The important point is how public some of this work was. In ports and trading towns, women could be seen working while travellers and buyers passed by. That made the labour part of the spectacle. The captors used visible domestic and menial labour as a way to reinforce status differences. The daily repetition of tasks under watch was psychological pressure. It taught captives their place and reminded them constantly of their dependence. It also made escape harder. A woman who worked in a communal area, under guard, and in unfamiliar language and culture had few chances to slip away without notice. Forced labour also changed how the community that once knew the woman would remember her. If she was later ransomed or escaped, neighbours might still see her as someone who had been publicly reduced in rank. In addition, the particular kinds of work assigned could be designed to humiliate. Tasks associated with waste, filth, or sexualized labour were especially degrading because they attacked a person's self-respect and social role. This type of humiliation accumulated over time. Slavery's cruelty often worked through long, repeated exposure rather than single violent acts. Archaeological evidence shows large-scale production and domestic work centres in Viking trading towns, which implies organised use of captive labour. Written accounts, when they mention women, consistently record that they were put to work in service roles that placed them under daily surveillance. Number 8. Theft of identity. Stripping jewellery, clothing, and rank. Clothing, brooches, belts, and other personal items carried meaning. They signalled wealth, family connections, regional styles, or religious identity. When raiders stripped captives of their jewellery and fine garments, they did more than take valuables. They erased identity markers. A widow's brooch that tied her to a particular family or an embroidered dress that marked her social status were symbolic assets. Removing them meant the woman no longer presented herself to others as she once had. Raiders often took valuables immediately after capture. Jewellery was convenient to carry, easy to sell or melt down, and served as trophies. Beyond theft, captors sometimes dressed women in plain or degrading clothing to mark them as thralls. The visible change in dress functioned like a public announcement of loss. Anyone who knew the woman could see she'd been taken. That visual cue reinforced humiliation and made the captive's new status obvious to everyone. The theft also had legal consequences. In many societies, particular items could serve as proof of family ties or inheritance claims. When those objects were removed, defence of property and lineage became harder. For women whose status depended partly on the display of certain items, their removal was an assault on social position. The deliberate removal of identity markers is an especially effective form of long-term humiliation because it targets how people are recognised within their communities. Over time, without the outward signs that tied them to family or rank, captives could be assimilated into new roles more easily, and the memory of their previous life faded. Number 9. Forced removal of children and family roles. Separating women from their children was an act that combined practical manipulation with deep humiliation. Raiders often split families to increase control and profit. A mother might be taken to one market, while her children were sent to another, or they might be kept by different buyers. The trauma of losing one's children is profound in any era, but in pre-modern societies where family responsibilities defined much of a person's identity, the loss undermined the core of a woman's role. The immediate effect was helplessness. A mother's inability to protect or care for her children was experienced not only as personal loss, but as social failure. That perception imposed by captors served to degrade and control. The long-term consequences could include permanent separation, as children were raised in new households and cultures, often losing language and ties to their original family. For women who were later ransomed or freed, the fact that their children remained elsewhere created a continuing wound. The removal of family roles was also a strategic move by raiders. By breaking family structures, they reduced the chance of collective resistance. Scattered families could not easily regroup to rebuild their communities or mount revenge. On a broader level, this practice had demographic consequences. If raids repeatedly removed children and young adults, communities could decline in numbers and social cohesion over generations. This made the initial humiliation part of a larger pattern of lasting harm. Number 10. Use in ceremonies of victory and mockery. In some cases, captives were incorporated into public rituals that celebrated the raiders' success. This could take the form of forcing a captive woman to appear at feasts, to perform tasks in front of guests, or to act as a symbol of conquest during celebrations. Turning a human being into part of a ritual display reduced personhood to an emblem. The captive's presence at a feast or ceremony was meant to demonstrate ownership and to make the victory tangible to those who watched. Such uses were not just entertainment, they were messages. When a raider paraded a leader's wife at a celebration, it told allies and rivals that he had power over the defeated family. That public shaming reinforced the raider's social position and demoralized opponents. The practice also had a storytelling function. Feasts were occasions to recount deeds, name victories, and bind followers through shared memory. Including captives in these events anchored the raid in social memory and tied the captive's fate to the raider's prestige. For the woman involved, being compelled to attend or be displayed at rituals meant repeated exposure to humiliation. If the ceremony included mockery of the captive's people or forced tasks that symbolized subjugation, the psychological damage could be deep and long-lasting. Contemporary accounts are patchy, but descriptions from travelers and later chroniclers indicate that captives played visible roles in post-raid celebrations and public events in ways meant to underline dominance. If you found this video eye-opening, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into hidden history.